iOS versus Android, the latest from podnews.net with co-host, powerful podcast hosting for agencies and brands. Android is still highly fragmented for podcast apps, according to data from the Open Podcast Prefix project analysed by Podnews today. Data from almost 5 million downloads in May suggests that while Spotify is the clear leader, the app ecosystem on Android remains significantly more fragmented than that of Apple, even when combining downloads from iOS, iPadOS and macOS. By way of illustration, the number 10 podcast app for Android devices has 2.4% of all downloads, but the number 10 podcast app for Apple devices has 4 times less at 0.6%. And if you're wondering what the number 10 podcast app for Android was, Stitcher, which announced its closure this week. The data also highlights the advantage Spotify gains from having an Android app, with a 42% share of all downloads on Android, 2.5 times the market share it gets on Apple. The Apple Podcasts app, of course, is not yet available on Android. OP3, the Open Podcast Prefix project, measures download data for over 600 different shows. You can find a sample of its data on the Podcast Business Journal website and add your podcast to the service for free. Elsewhere, the podcast host has published the IndiePod Manifesto based on a census of independent podcasters earlier in the year. How do you guarantee success for indie podcasters? Play the long game, say most creators. Congratulations to the Wonder Media Network for turning 5 years old. A great long-form read we've found, about 4 in-depth daily news podcasts taking their time and getting the story right. You'll find that in the Canadian Review of Journalism. It's by Tim Cook, but not that Tim Cook. A smart idea to get the most out of your podcast: turn the transcripts into a book. The History of Chinese Philosophy is produced from transcripts of the China History podcast from Laszlo Montgomery. The latest Pod News Weekly Review contains an interview with Naomi Meller.
Hi, it's Naomi Meller here, co-founder of the International Women's Podcast Awards. Thanks so much to Pod News. I'll be on later on chatting about this year's awards and everything else you need to know.
Entries for that opened earlier this week, and our sister publication Podcast Business Journal this week contains an interview with Sparfax, a company that can get your podcast onto the seatbacks of aeroplanes.
Some people want to cross the Atlantic and just listen to Adele, and some people are always looking for something new.
Find out how it works, what airlines want, and how you can get there at podcastbusinessjournal.com. And thank you to Bjorn Barfoed Vestergaard, who has become our latest personal supporter, and he doesn't pronounce his name like that, I'm sure. Anyway, he's based in Denmark. He hosts the Role Models podcast, which he describes as an attempt to demystify success, to get to the human behind and create a collection of concrete tools, habits and strategies that you and I will be able to use today to kickstart our dreams, or at least he would do if you spoke Danish. Our dream too is that you support our journalism at podnews.net/support. And in podcast news, Small Town Dicks will be covering the 1981 Carmel, Sonia Stone and Michael Glazebrook case in a new season which started today. The 2-part episode comes on the heels of Glazebrook's sentencing to life in prison earlier this month. And the Formula One season makes it to Silverstone shortly. Max Gallagher and Tom Bellingham are 2 die-hard fans of Formula One, and in February they turned their passion into a project, launching their first podcast, P1, with Matt and Tommy. On launch, the show went straight to the top of the Apple and Spotify podcast charts and has since amassed over 4 million listens and a social following of 1.5 million. This podcast is sponsored by Co-Host and Quill. Co-Host's B2B analytics and advanced demographics dive into a listener's workplace, age, gender, income, hobbies, and social media habits. Follow brands like Expedia and PricewaterhouseCoopers who leverage these insights. Book a demo now at cohostpodcasting.com, and we thank them for their support this month. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.